I'm Francesco Assani, and I'm here interviewing Mark Devlin, who's probably not very known in the sort of here in Italy. No, correct me if I'm wrong, but your work wasn't probably is not probably very known here.
Sure.
And you've been a DJ for 25 years, and now turn to an author on sort of a truth subject regarding this music environment, this music scene. So first of all, if it's all right with you, I like you to make an sort of a quick overview of how the music and entertainment industries are used as this powerful means of societal control, actually. Societal control and, for just mind controlling the masses. Because, many people can see, politicians, kind of conspiring behind the scenes, or, big businesses, etc. But they sort of let their guard down when it comes to the actual entertainment and in particular music industries, movies, etc. So if you can just for starters give an overview of how this relates into this whole mind control of the masses.
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, for getting me on, Francesco. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and to address a new audience. As you say, I'm probably not that well known in Italy, and unfortunately my Italian is not that great. I can order off an Italian menu, and I know how to mention all the names of pasta, but beyond that, my Italian is pretty poor. So I'm grateful that you're able to speak to me in English, and I hope that people can understand what I'm saying. The funny thing about Italy is I've been a DJ for the last 28 years now, and I've played in 40 different countries, including all over Europe. But for some reason, I've never done a gig in Italy. I've played everywhere else. I've played France, Germany, all the obvious big countries. I've played some of the smaller ones like Montenegro and Macedonia, but I've never made it to Italy. And when it comes to doing these presentations and these talks, I've never addressed an audience in Italy there either, so it's new territory for me. So it is good to get the opportunity to talk to people. So my situation is, I've been a DJ all these years, a radio and club DJ, and things just continued along that path all the way through from 1990, when I got started, to 2010, which is the year when I consider myself to have had a conscious awakening. That's where I came to some realizations about the true nature of this reality in which we find ourselves and what's really going on in the world and who's really running things, because the real story is very different to the official version of events that we get given by government ministers and the mainstream media and other sources of authority. If you only listen to mainstream news and you believe everything your government tells you, you would think that the world is a very different place to what it actually is. You would think that governments are there to protect you, they care about you. You would think that the educational establishments, schools, colleges, universities are there to educate you and uplift you. You would think that war is necessary, and when we go off to fight in foreign countries, it's to keep us free and to keep us safe from terror. And none of these things are true. If you just listen to mainstream sources, you would think that doctors and hospitals and the pharmaceutical industry is there to make you well and give you medication that's going to keep you healthy. And it turns out the opposite is actually the case. So in all these walks of life, the official version of things is actually an inversion of what is really going on. And when you stop listening to mainstream news and you stop reading newspapers and you stop listening to what government ministers and sources of apparent authority tell you, and you actually go out there and do your own research and independently look into these things off your own back, you realise that this world is actually upside down and back to front. And whenever you're told anything in the mainstream, the official version of something, if you want to find the truth of the matter, it usually involves flipping it back to front, and you'll find the truth somewhere there. So these are all realizations that I came to in 2010. And it was the tail end of a long process of reading a whole bunch of books and musing and reflecting and doing a lot of thinking about these important subjects, these big questions in life. And it got to the point in 2010 where I just realised that everything I'd been told through pretty much all my life had been deception and duplicity. And I set about trying to reassess my entire worldview. And that really involved just chucking out everything that I thought I'd learnt and had come to know up to that point, and starting again with a blank sheet of paper. And I realised that this deception and these lies that are foisted on us from birth all the way through our childhood, all the way into our adult years, actually permeates every single aspect of daily human life. So you find it in politics, you find it in the mainstream media, you find it in the health industry, you find it coming from big business, you find it in the military, you find it in the world of science. And if that's the case, and if certain groups and networks have hijacked all these different institutions and all these different walks of life and steered them off in their own desired directions, which is actually what has happened, you wouldn't expect it to be any different in the world of entertainment, and specifically movies, television, and the music industry. So being a guy that had worked in the music industry as a DJ, my specialist area of interest became discovering how the music industry has played its own part in this massive deception that is foisted upon all of humanity by the small number of individuals that are controlling things from the top down. And that's been my area of research now for the last 8 years, coming to understand how the music industry has been used pretty much since the start, all the way back to the inception, back in the 1940s, 1950s, for mass mind control and culture creation and social engineering.
And even before maybe.
Well, probably before that, yeah. I'm talking about the modern corporate industry, which you can trace back to the 40s or 50s. But yeah, I'm sure it goes back even further to the days of classical music, the classical greats. And, even back into the ancient world and some of these tribal civilizations and the use of music there in conjunction with ritual and ceremonies and things like that. So it's been going on forever. And my task has been trying to understand the various methods that have been used. And that's formed the basis of the 2 books that I've now put out called Musical Truth, Volumes 1 and 2. And that forms the basis of all these talks that I do and all these radio shows and all these podcasts. So this is my life right now. Who would have believed it?
Yes, well, we find ourselves in... once you discover this kind of things, you realize that, your life it's not really going to be quite the same.
Exactly. Exactly. No going back.
Okay, so regarding your books, here I have a physical copy of Musical Truth, Volume 1, which I unfortunately not be able to show. So I have to. Well, if anybody understands English or any English speaker that might be listening, I highly suggest that you grab a copy of these books and read them, because they are very. I found them very, informative and enlightening too. So, what? So, was there a particular moment that kind of prompted you to start being vocal about these things, or you just decided upon giving it some thought of your own?
Well, I'd like to say there was a eureka moment, a moment of epiphany, where I went to bed one night and I woke up in the morning and suddenly everything made sense. But it wasn't like that. It was a gradual process for me. It was just several months of collating information and putting it all together in my mind. And I reached a point in 2010 where I felt very differently about the world and my place in it. So I do pinpoint that year as the one where it all started to make sense. But yeah, just the reason I do what I do is because when I came to a comprehension of how humanity is mind-controlled and how we're manipulated in so many ways by this very small group of elites, as they like to think of themselves, who are ultimately at the end of the day, dark occult magic practitioners. And I know that sounds crazy to people the first time they hear it, but the only way that this small group has been able to maintain such a stranglehold on humanity for so long, and to do it under the radar, is because they have an understanding of how the nature of reality works and how to harness energy and manipulate it for their own means. So they are dark occult practitioners. They adhere to this dark religion, which goes all the way back into the ancient world and has been passed down through the generations via these various secret societies through which they operate. And they've had representatives of their own kind put into positions of authority and power in all these different walks of life that I spoke about. So the world of politics and media, entertainment, and all the rest of it. And that's how they can ensure that all these different institutions and aspects are used to control us. So they understand how spiritual law works. They understand how karma, consequentialism, the law of cause and effect works. And like I say, they understand how to harness and manipulate energetic states and sound frequencies, which are actually the basis, the building blocks of this reality in which we find ourselves. We think of it as a physical world, but it's only physical in the way that we decode it into the reality that we experience. Before that decoding process, everything exists in the form of frequency and energy. And, you know, the genius scientist and inventor Nikola Tesla made a comment to the effect that if you want to understand the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency and vibration, because he understood how it all works. And I'm saying that these elite occult practitioners also understand how these things work, and they're using these dynamics against the rest of us. They see us, the vast majority, the masses, the great unwashed, you know, the public out there.
Oh, yes.
You and I and people listening to this podcast as the profane ones. They see us as spiritually ignorant. They see us as existing in darkness, and they see us as basically cattle, just fodder that they can exploit and they can mistreat. And because they see us as completely ignorant of spiritual truth, they've maintained this tactical advantage over us. So my viewpoint is it's very important for the rest of us, the masses, to gain an understanding of the way these dynamics work and to understand the tactics that have been used against us, and to step up to the responsibility that we have towards truth and towards our fellow humanity to put an end to this system of control that's been going on for far too long. It's time we took back our power, and that can happen any time enough of us decide that we want that to happen. So it's this dynamic that motivates me to do the work that I do, and many, many others as well. I've heard many other researchers talk about this reason for putting their work out there. And that's really why my life is now the way it is.
Yes, most definitely. I'm afraid, though, convincing people that these, the ultimate parasitic class at the top are also believe they really believe in this. They really are well into the in the occult sphere. I find it, in real examples in real life, quite the more difficult part. I don't know about you, but
well, for sure. But Francesco, there's three things I say to people when I'm having this kind of conversation. When I try and bring up these subjects and I'm with somebody that's not looked into any of this stuff before and it all sounds alien and fantastic and outrageous to them, there's three things I ask them to consider. One is, I say, just imagine you were one of this elite ruling class that I speak about, one of these occult practitioners that is hell-bent on controlling the rest of humanity. Just, suspend your disbelief for a second and put yourself in their position. Now, how would you set about trying to control the rest of humanity? Is a tactic that you would use to hijack and take over as many of these different institutions as you could? Would you, for instance, want to take over the entertainment industry? Would you want to make a decision as to which pop music artists get put out in the out there to the mainstream, would you want to control what kind of symbolism and what kind of ideas and values are conveyed in music videos? Would you want to do that? And I think if you put it like that to most people, they would see the point and they would say, well, yeah, I would actually take on board that tactic, that method, if I was trying to achieve that. Okay, so that's number one. The second thing that I say to people is, I'm telling you that this level of control is going on a covert basis, and that they have the likes of you and your families, your children, in their sights. They want the minds and the hearts and the souls of your children. Now, It might sound like I'm talking bullshit. It might sound like I'm a crazy guy. But can you afford to take that chance? What if I'm not crazy? What if there's that faint chance that I'm telling the truth and there's something here you need to look at? Particularly people that have children that are going to have to grow up in this insane world in the next few decades, unless we adults, around now, take the responsibility to turn things around. So that's another thing you can say to people. I might sound crazy, but can you afford to take the chance? Are you at least not going to go away and spend an hour or two looking into this stuff to see if there's any validity to it? And then the third thing you can say to people is, if this kind of situation that I've just outlined was really going on, would you want to know about it? Or would you prefer to be kept in ignorance and to be kept in spiritual darkness and to be mind controlled and to be seen as fodder and to be seen as just an ignorant fool? Now, most people, if you put it like that to them, I think they would come back at you and say, well, of course I would want to know, yeah, if it was happening. In which case you can go back to them and say, right, well, I'm here to tell you that it is happening in exactly the way I've just described. Now, we've just established that if it were happening in this way, you would want to know. So here I am telling you that it is happening. You'd still get a large number of people at that point that would still scoff and shrug it off and say, oh, no, this just sounds too fantastic. I can't believe this is the case.
Yeah.
In which case you would say, well, you've just told me that you would want to know about it if you were being controlled in this way. And yet, now that I've told you are, you're still scoffing at it and laughing at it and saying it can't possibly be true. Yeah. So, people at least owe it to themselves to go away and do the research and discover for themselves whether guys like me are talking crazy or whether we've actually done the due diligence and researched this stuff for ourselves, and what we're giving you is the truth as best we understand it.
Well, yes, but yes, and yeah, the fact is, most people say, oh, this is just BS and conspiracy theory, but they actually, sometimes I ask, well, how much research did you do? Well, nothing, because that's just BS. Okay, so I guess you're an expert on it.
Exactly. And ask people to look into where the phrase conspiracy theorist came from in the first place. That was a creation of the CIA. They invented that phrase in the 1960s in response to the large number of people that were starting to ask questions about the official version of the Kennedy assassination, because people were noticing that so much of what they were being told didn't stack up, such as Oswald acting alone. And so they came up with this term, conspiracy theorist, as a derogatory way of writing off these people as apparently crazy, and is stuck to this day. And now you get phrases like anti-Semite. So whenever anyone says anything vaguely critical of somebody who just happens to be Jewish, it's never about what you're saying about that person. The validity of what you might be saying is never looked into. The minute you say something critical of someone who just happens to be Jewish, you get the phrase anti-Semite slapped on you. The minute you say something vaguely critical of someone who just happens to be homosexual, you're not talking about the fact that they're homosexual, you're saying something else about them. But if they happen to be a homosexual person, you get the phrase homophobe slapped on you. Yeah. And all these phrases, people need to understand: homophobe, anti-Semite, conspiracy theorist, tinfoil hat, nut job, these all come out of organisations such as the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, the Frankfurt School, the Fabian Society, Oxford and Cambridge, Yale and Harvard universities, all these think tank social engineering organisations which specialise in steering culture and values off in desired directions. That's the very reason for these places being set up in the first place. And then you've got organisations like the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, controlled by the Rothschild family. And they are there to slap that anti-Semite tag on anyone who dares to question anything about the Jewish Holocaust, for one. That's the big sort of smoking gun. But also anyone that happens to be Jewish. So why would there be a need for organisations such as this to be set up in the first place to steer off cultural values in these directions if they weren't there to stifle free speech and to prevent people from being able to express themselves freely and openly in society? And, we're told, those of us in certain countries, that we live in democracies where free speech is alive and well, but you start talking about some of these subjects in public and you find out just how much you are allowed to have free speech.
Most definitely. This whole, we are so free because we can vote, but then you are not allowed to do many things, not just regarding freedom of speech.
No, it's a joke. It's a farce. So many things are.
Yeah, and regarding this manipulation, this societal manipulation and this social engineering that actually creates pretty much all of this sort of these cultures that we've seen in the we've seen during the course of time. You talk about it extensively in your in particular in your second book. Where you delve into the topic of culture creation. And you go into the you talk about the parallels between the counterculture in the 60s and then the acid scene.
Acid house,
the rave parties in the mid 80s to the 90s and on then. So that's a very. Could you tell us something about this phenomenon?
A really good way for people to get a handle on how culture creation and social engineering works is to look at the amazing parallels between the UK acid house scene, which kicked off late 1987, and 1988 was known as the Second Summer of Love. So 88 is when this cultural revolution really took a hold in the UK. So we're on the 30th anniversary of it now, and the reason I wanted to get it in the book and the reason why it takes up the first two chapters is to mark that anniversary of 30 years, because there's going to be a lot of people of my kind of age. So I'm 47 now, which means I was 17 going on 18 when this acid house scene kicked off. So I was just at the right age to have got swept along and caught up in that whole cultural phenomenon, as I know many other people of my age will be. And I think when people revisit this whole scene with the benefit of hindsight and maturity and the ability to now do this research for ourselves, and they take a fresh look at what was being done to the minds and the consciousness of young people at that time, it's an absolute masterclass 101 in how social engineering works. And then you could take that further by applying the same scrutiny to the counterculture hippie scene of the 1960s. So the first Summer of Love was in 1967, coming largely out of San Francisco, and that whole thing, grew up out of California. And there's so much evidence that's now come to light through recent research. Many, many authors, researchers, filmmakers have shown how that whole scene, if it wasn't created in the first place by these agencies, was very early on hijacked and steered off in desired directions by the CIA. And many of the countercultural heroes and gurus and iconic figures of that scene, such as Dr. Timothy Leary, there's evidence to suggest that Terence McKenna, the consciousness guru, was in the employ of the FBI for some time, from documentation that's come to light. Guys like Ken Kesey and his Merry Pranksters, groups like the Grateful Dead. The Grateful Dead were basically a CIA creation. Two of the members worked directly with the CIA. Two more members were involved in the Bohemian Club, Bohemian Grove, which is one of these occult secret societies that you find so often in the background to these events. And so you look at the way the whole counterculture scene of the 60s went off. You had LSD everywhere. Seemingly unlimited quantities of the stuff was just appearing at all these festivals and all these hippie gatherings and communes and stuff. And it was being distributed by the CIA, basically. And it was going hand in hand with the music of the time, this psychedelic rock music that was coming out through all these bands that emerged out of Laurel Canyon in LA and Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. And then you contrast that with the social conditions of the time, all these protests and marches and all the demonstrations, all the Black Panther stuff that was happening, black rights, civil rights in the 1960s. You had the Vietnam War waging overseas. You had the birth of feminism via Gloria Steinem, who was actually another CIA asset, it turns out. You had the birth control pill. You know, all these major social changes were happening all at the same time. This one big melting pot. And you had a soundtrack to it, which was this psychedelic rock, and you had a drug of choice. There were obviously other drugs going around, but LSD was the one of the time. Now you apply that same spotlight to what happened in the UK in 1987 going into 88. And you had similar sort of conditions of social unrest. So we had the conservative Tory government under Margaret Thatcher that had been in place for many years. And lots of young people were feeling disenfranchised and cut off and left out by that government and forgotten. They were very critical about it. You had the poll tax going on at the time, which was, this unfair method of extorting money out of people for their property. And out of nowhere, seemingly, you just had this movement that was created. And the official story is there were these 4 young London DJs that went out to Ibiza, and they were captivated by the eclectic spirit of embracing all these different styles of music and partying out in the open, under the stars, expressing themselves freely. And they came back to London and brought that whole ethos with them and established their own club nights. And we're told that's how the whole acid house movement took off. So 1988, like I say, was dubbed the second summer of love. So the media was already comparing it to what had happened in California in 1967. And you had a new drug. So instead of LSD in the 60s, suddenly it was all about ecstasy, known as E, or MDMA in one of its other forms. And this stuff seemingly just came out of nowhere. So, prior to 1987, nobody was going out to clubs and popping E's. But by 1988, it had become a staple part of a weekend out for many, many young people in Britain. And the thing about that whole scene is it wasn't just isolated to 87 and 88 and then it went away again. What that whole phenomenon did was laid the foundations for the way dance music culture and clubbing culture came to be embraced by the whole of the rest of the world, literally. So we can fast forward 30 years to where we are now, 2018. Electronic dance music is popular in pretty much every country in the world. You'd be hard-pressed to find any country that doesn't have clubs in its major cities where they're playing this sort of music, where large numbers of young people are congregating, getting blissed out, getting euphoric and ecstatic to this music. And the music's changed so much over the years as well. But everything has to have its roots, everything has to have a story as to where it came from. And so what I'm proposing in the book is that whole acid house scene, again, if it wasn't created from the off by these intelligence agencies, by these social engineering organisations, then very early on it was infiltrated by them and it was ensured that everything went off in a direction that suited the ruling class. I actually am of the view that the whole thing was created from the start with these long-term plans in mind, because the controllers that we're talking about, they play the long game and they display incredible levels of patience. They don't just plan what they're going to do next year. They know what they're doing decades in advance. They've probably got the next 30 or 40 years already mapped out. So back in 1987, they knew where they wanted to take this whole thing. And what we have now is electronic dance music festivals all over the world, particularly in the US. It's very much centered around California in the US and Los Angeles in particular. So we're right back to that same city in terms of where many of these big festivals and events go. And you look at some of the symbolism and some of the imagery and the themes that are employed at these big festivals. And it's all about mystical, kind of spiritual, metaphysical themes. There's a very big push of transhumanist imagery.
Oh, yes.
AI, futurist transhumanism. You see it in the names of the events, like Awakenings and Digital Dreams and Dream State and Electric Daisy Carnival and all these names that conjure up these same images. And then you look at the imagery that's employed on the big screens at these shows, and you look at the music itself and what's going into the music. It's all digital, it's all electronic in nature. There's stuff going on with the sound frequencies at a hidden level. Who knows what kind of manipulations are going on there? And when you factor all that in with the mind-altering drugs that are being taken by literally hundreds of thousands of people at these events, then there's a very high level of manipulation and mind control that is going on, and hardly anyone seems to notice it. Nobody's really talking about this. I've not seen any other books out there that have a look at the acid house scene and what it led to, the worldwide electronic dance music phenomenon, with anything other than the official version of things. So there's hundreds of books that talk about how the acid house scene got started, the official version, the Wikipedia version of it. But nobody else is putting all these things together and asking questions about why it bears so many similarities to what happened in the 60s, why there's all these suspicious elements to it, like where all the ecstasy came from and how it was so freely distributed, and why these festivals now are all incorporating the same themes and the same occult symbolism. These are very pertinent questions that people need to ask. And at the moment, we have very large numbers of young clubbers that are getting manipulated on a spiritual, emotional, mental level every time they go out to rave and listen to this music, and they have absolutely no idea what's happening to them. They're being used as lab rats, guinea pigs, test subjects, you know?
Yeah.
And it's been that way for a very long time.
The acid scene started, as you said, in the mid-90s, the mid-80s, but I remember. I also remember that everybody was talking about this, ecstasy that came out. It seems, magically out of nowhere, and all this kind of disco and both, disco clubs and rave parties scene that was going on till to the actual to where we are at the point where we are now. So it's still going on. And
I think the big scene in Italy was centered around Rimini, if I remember, early 90s. A lot of dance parties around Rimini.
Well, yes, because that area there is famous for its the discotheques and clubs. So
right.
It was a good place to sort of spark this whole phenomenon.
And you had a big explosion of dance music coming out of Italy around about 1989. Obviously, Black Box, Ride on Time is the one that most people will think of, but there was a producer called Daniele Devlin that was doing a lot of this stuff. And many Italian acts, I think Starlight Numero Uno, they were Italian, and many others. There was a big burst of it coming out of Italy around those times.
I've always kept my distance from this sort of scene due to the negative, of course, the negative publicity, the negative fame that it got after all this, after the ecstasy, all the ecstasy was kind of pushed in this type of environment. So,
sure.
Anyway, yes, people need to go to the root cause and the real reasons behind this type of also these substances that are pushed into this movement, and but unfortunately, for the majority, most of the time, they just think they came out of the blue, and so.
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole thing about many of these kids going to these acid parties in the early days and these dance festivals now is people are conditioned to think that they're free, that they're expressing themselves, that they're being individual, and they're absolutely not. They're being controlled at every level. It's always on somebody else's terms. So whenever any big fad or trend or movement rises up, you can be sure that it's been the product of one of these social engineering think tanks, these culture creators, because they would never leave it to chance as to which movements and which fads and which styles of music get that big. I mean, if you accept that this same elite class that we're talking about have completely controlled governments all over the world, they've got the banking and financial system in their pocket, they control all the big business, all the food and drink companies, the pharmaceutical companies, the technology companies, all of that, they control the world of science and academia and education.
Yeah.
Does anyone really think that having achieved all of that, they're going to allow a scene like acid house to evolve into this massive worldwide phenomenon of dance music just off its own back, just organically, just let it go off naturally? They would never do that. They would want to be in control of every aspect of it, every stage of the way. And that's exactly what they have done, because nothing gets this big unless it's allowed to get this big. Yeah. That's how social engineering gets done. And they have their chosen ones, their agents that ensure all this stuff happens. And this is where we get into the world of the lifetime actor, which I discuss in the same chapter concerning culture creation. So lifetime actors are people that are thought of as one thing in the public eye. They have a public persona. They might be a politician, a business leader. They might be a familiar actor. They could be a television presenter, a supermodel, a sports star, or a musician. And you see one of them, Bill Gates, for example, and you think, oh, yeah, that's Bill Gates. He's the Microsoft guy. Yeah, or Jim Morrison of The Doors. Oh, yeah, he's that rock god, that rock icon. But so often, when you do some delving into the backgrounds of these people, you discover all the same elements cropping up time and time again. There are links going back to military intelligence more times than you would believe. So direct links to the CIA, the FBI, MI6, the Pentagon, other aspects of military intelligence, links going back to the Tavistock Institute and groups such as that. You have links to dark occult groups, mystery school groups like Freemasons and the Church of Satan and Bohemian Club, Bohemian Grove, Skull and Bones coming out of Yale University. You have some very unsettling, unsavory links going into the world of mind control, trauma-based mind control and satanic ritual abuse, which again is outrageous for so many people to hear. And you start talking about that stuff and lots of people will switch off without doing the research. And it's a shame that they do that, because this is a very ugly part of what is really going on in this world that needs facing up to. And so many people don't want to go there. But you discover time and time again all these nefarious links. And something else you discover is bloodlines, ancestry, which is very important to how this stuff all gets done. So many of these lifetime actors, these chosen ones that are served up to us, because the public never chooses these people. You get these people paraded to you. All of a sudden there's this new pop star like Lady Gaga comes out, and Katy Perry or Taylor Swift, and we didn't select these people. The corporations just serve them up. They say, here she is, the next big thing. We don't select who our television presenters are. We don't select who the Hollywood actors are. They just get dished up to us, and we're invited to embrace them and take them on, And it's the same thing with politicians. I know people think that we get a choice through voting, but it's not really a choice, because all the candidates that we're given to vote for are pre-selected anyway. So it doesn't really matter which one gets in, because the system wins either way. And these lifetime actors ensure that everything goes off according to the script, and that nothing is random, nothing is natural, and, nothing takes its own course. Everything is mapped out. And it's been this way for a very long time. And people really need to get a grip on how all this is done. And in the first place, just face up to the fact that it is done. And like I say, that's the first step towards taking back our power.
Yes, and since you've talked about this, all these quote-unquote artists like Lady Gaga and Taylor Swift, etc., there is something that maybe people don't realize over here, that let's say some of these artists that became quite big names, like for example of course, many people know Britney Spears, Justin Timberlake, and who was the other one? Christina Aguilera.
Yeah.
They actually their story is quite particular, because they actually, and maybe you can explain it a little. They came from the what was it? The Mickey Mouse Disney Club, something like that.
Yeah, Mickey Mouse Club.
And and then their music, as you say, they started off as kind of innocent sort of innocent characters, and then all of a sudden they switch to more nastiness and
Well, the worst thing any parent can do is let Disney raise their child.
Yeah.
Because we're given cover stories for everything. We're given innocent sounding surface gloss versions of everything. And, the cover version that we get, the Wikipedia version of Disney, is that it's this lovely organisation with family values, and they put out entertainment for kids, and they're lovely and nice and fluffy, But the truth of the matter is very, very different. Disney is an extremely satanic, dark organisation steeped in occult activity.
Yeah, let that sink a little bit in the mind of people, because they need to understand that, because otherwise.
Yeah, so Walt Disney himself was an occultist, he was a Freemason. That's another link you find time and time again, links going back to Freemasonry. And it's been shown, there's countless YouTube videos that people can go to online that show how stuff gets hidden in Disney cartoons. And it's sexually explicit references, drawings of bloody penises and the word sex and people having sex and topless women that are subliminally encoded into cartoons. So they're just there for a split second, but they're going into the unconscious mind, the subconscious mind of the kids that are watching all this stuff and having an effect on them and shaping their perceptions of sexuality and all that kind of stuff. So it's dark sorcery and magic that's going on. In so many Disney cartoons, you find the parents of the central character get killed time and time again. Is that really a nice, pleasant story for kids to be absorbing over and over? And then you can take the Mickey Mouse Club, which is this kind of breeding ground where they groom future pop artists. And as you said, Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera and Justin Timberlake were all part of the Mickey Mouse Club in the same year. And it's always the same pattern. They put these kids out as child stars, and when they first start out, they're squeaky clean and wholesome and girl or boy next door, and they seem very harmless, and it puts parents off their guard because they think, oh, this is a nice role model for my son or daughter to be looking at. And they continue down that road for a few years, putting out nice songs and stuff, and then all of a sudden they do a switch. So with Britney Spears, suddenly she's in that schoolgirl outfit in Hit Me One More Time, and she's being all raunchy and sexual and seductive. They did the same thing with Christina Aguilera, and of course the classic when it comes to Disney would be Miley Cyrus, who initially was Hannah Montana, girl next door, nice squeaky clean image, and then a few years down the line she's become this absolute debaucherous, hedonistic, pornographic slut. An absolute whore, the whore of Babylon, in terms of the imagery that she portrays. So imagine you've got all these young girls that grew up with Hannah Montana and thought, oh, she's nice, I want to be like her when I grow up. And then Miley Cyrus suddenly appears in videos dressed as a baby, touching herself up, simulating masturbation on stage. And these same kids, the same girls that have grown up with her, are now seeing all this stuff. And this is what they do time and time again. They get you off your guard, and it's only later that they do the switch on you. It's a standard tactic with Disney, and it's something that people need to be aware of, because it's all mind control and it's all subtle manipulation. And there's another very ugly side of the entertainment industry, which is all about trauma-based mind control that I touched on earlier. So many of these artists, particularly the ones that were child stars, turn out to have been, so lots of evidence shows, subject to horrific traumatic abuse during their childhood, sexual abuse at the hands of sometimes family members, but sometimes others. And there's a whole world of trauma-based mind control. It goes into the CIA's MK-Ultra program, which is a very far-reaching method of societal mind control. But it happens on an individual basis as well, which is where you get divisions of it, such as monarch programming and beta programming. And there's lots of different names for it, but monarch programming is very specific to the entertainment industry, and more Hollywood actors and pop stars than you would believe show signs of having been subject to this, which is exposure to trauma, horrific traumatic situations which cause the human mind. It was discovered by, early practitioners of this, that if you subject the human mind to enough terrible, horrific experiences, it actually dissociates from reality because the mind can't cope with the reality that it's experiencing. So it causes the mind to shatter and splinter into these different compartments. And somebody that knows what they're doing can then program each of these compartments with a different personality. And these different personalities can be brought to the fore by way of triggers. Trigger words or phrases or sounds or colours, patterns, that kind of thing. And this is what we've seen happening so many times in public. There are YouTube videos that people can get where some of these familiar entertainers and TV presenters, even newscasters, are seen to switch between these different personalities because they've been triggered by something they've just heard. And that's why I say there's more of these people out there in the public eye than you would believe, because mind control is everywhere. It's completely endemic in the industry. That's how the controllers get these artists to do their bidding, and they have them stay on script, on track, doing what they want them to do, rather than thinking for themselves and expressing themselves in their own way. So mind control is absolutely everywhere. It's very horrific, but it's very real.
Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, are you familiar with the TV series Dollhouse?
No, I don't think so. I don't watch TV, so...
Oh, yeah.
Only for research.
Yeah, no, these days I do too, but, before... and, you have this... when you're researching these topics, I often think about stuff that I've watched in the past and said, aha, there's something definitely there, because it's a series about these women, these girls that they sign a contract and they are part of this structure that where they kind of erase their mind. And then they program these women from time to time to do different kind of things. They can be used as, sex mates and assassins. All sorts of things. So that was kind of interesting there.
And they tell you the truth about this stuff in Hollywood movies as well. That's what so many Hollywood movies are. People could think of the Bourne trilogy with Matt Damon. Yeah. Think about what his character was. He's supposed to have been an employee of the CIA, and he's been subject to some kind of mind control programming, which has erased his memory. And there are certain triggers that kind of bring some of those memories back to him, and they're trying to get rid of him the whole time because he knows too much, and they don't want him to divulge the secrets of the program. And there's a great film, a little known film from the 1970s called Telephone, and it stars Charles Bronson and Lee Remick, and it's about those two are programmed assassins, and they get their orders by telephone. They get trigger words spoken to them over the phone, and it kind of activates this part of their personality that turns them into programmed assassins. And it's all about that. And you've also got the Hollywood movie Conspiracy Theory with Mel Gibson from 1997, where he's this guy who's supposed to be a crazy taxi driver. He spends all day driving around talking these crazy theories to his punters, in the car. But it actually turns out that everything he says to them about what's really going on in the world is true. It's actually happening. And it's later revealed in the film that he's been a subject of this CIA MKUltra mind control program. They even reference it by name. They claim that it was shut down in the 1970s. I don't believe that for a second. But, they're telling you right there what they do. And they're encoding the truth into these Hollywood movies, which is what they do so often. They give us the truth of a matter in apparent works of fiction. So you think you're just watching this movie and it's all escapism and fantasy and imagination, but they're giving you real truths in that. Meantime, you turn on the evening news and you think you're getting the truth of what's going on in the world, and they're being honest with you, and all of it is just complete lies and bullshit and deception. So talk about an upside down inverted world.
Oh yeah, that's definitely where we're living. But they also do this to then be able to ridicule people that actually talk about these things.
Exactly.
And have research.
They can say you've been watching too many movies. You need to get real.
Too many movies. Yeah. For example, now there was a Geostorm that came out recently. It's about weather control, weather manipulation.
Yeah.
There is this evil guy that creates these tsunamis, and I don't know because I haven't watched it. I just watched the trailer. But so now, if you talk about chemtrailing and weather management, you say, "Oh, you're like that movie, right? You're watching
exactly
watching too much."
And they make these villains, they make all the villains like some James Bond villain, like Blofeld or something. And it's kind of interesting when you look at that, when you look at the James Bond films, because Ian Fleming was a military intelligence guy. He worked in the naval intelligence during the Second World War and beyond that as well. And he even worked alongside Aleister Crowley for a period, this notorious occultist. And his is a name that crops up time and time again when you get into research regarding the music industry and some of the dark occult ritualistic stuff that goes on in the background. But James Bond's arch nemesis was always this guy Blofeld, and he's this megalomaniac that's hell-bent on world control. And he's actually a depiction of one of these elite bloody oligarchs, one of these, elite types that we're talking about here. And in one of the stories on Her Majesty's Secret Service, Blofeld is obsessed with discovering his ancestry. So he employs this genealogist to look into his bloodline and who his ancestors were, where he came from. And that's telling us something as well, because like I mentioned earlier, bloodlines and who people's ancestors were is key to so many of these public figures we get given, because they just roll out different generations of the same bloodlines in all these public roles, century after century. It's very, very interesting to look into the genealogy of many of these figures, and they're not who you thought they were.
Yeah, sure. And how much time do we have left?
We can go for another 15
minutes. So because I really like to, since we were talking about monarch programming, beta programming, I think we should definitely talk about predictive programming.
Sure.
Because this is also used in the music industry, in the music sector, to put in our subconscious, particular events that are going to take place. Of course, these events are structured and prepared by this the elite controllers, if you want to call them this. So can you talk about the various episodes of predictive programming regarding specific events in the music world?
Yeah, well, predictive programming is the art of placing a depiction of a real-world event or an apparent real-world event, because sometimes this symbolism foreshadows something which actually happens, but sometimes it foreshadows the version of events that we're asked to believe. So it's my view, and the view of many researchers, that many of these so-called terrorist events that we witness in the news don't happen the way we're told they happen. And it's my view that in some cases, when we're told people have died and a bomb's gone off or some crazy guy has gone around shooting people, nobody's actually died. The whole thing has been a staged hoax. And I know, again, there are so many things in this interview that people hearing it for the first time are just going to throw out and reject because it sounds impossible. But I would urge people not to just throw it out because it sounds ridiculous. Look into it. If I'm talking crazy, you'll soon discover if I'm talking crazy, because I'm just some mad guy spouting some stuff. But when you go away and do the research and you look at the huge number of YouTube videos there are, and the huge number of blogs, the huge number of books, documentary films, people that have spoken about this, radio shows, podcasts, you will see that this is very real, and that many, many researchers around the world have caught on to, the way all this stuff gets done. So predictive programming is where they get you ready for something which they know is coming. They get the subconscious mind of the public familiar with the narrative of the event by giving you depictions of it in movies or TV shows, cartoons, music videos, and sometimes live stage shows, music shows. And it's all kind of buried away within the narrative of what people are watching. So it's only absorbed by the subconscious mind. The conscious mind is not aware of what it's just absorbed, but the subconscious mind is where all the magic happens. That's where all the sorcery does its thing. And it sows values and beliefs and perceptions in the minds of large numbers of people. And some people believe that by placing a depiction of something in work that is going to be seen by many millions of people, the occultists are also helping to manifest this version of things that they want to bring into reality. You know, that gets into sorcery and sympathetic magic and all that kind of thing, which are complicated concepts. And there's also an aspect of it where many researchers, myself included, believe that what they're doing is placing the truth of a situation in plain sight. It's known as revelation of the method. And they're kind of, as they see it, letting us know what they plan to do and gaining our tacit consent for it. So when we don't voice any kind of objection to something they've told us they're going to do, even though they've told us in cryptic, symbolic form that most people could never be expected to interpret, nevertheless, as they see it, they've now told us, and the burden of, you know, consent or karma is now on us and off of them.
Yes.
It's a very sick, twisted, distorted way of looking at it, but that seems to be the way they do things. So predictive programming, the best example I can give is 9/11, the events of September 11th, 2001. Many, many depictions of it in movies, hundreds actually, in movies and TV shows in the years leading up to it. In the music industry,
advertisement.
Yeah, in the music industry, you have this sleeve to an album by Supertramp called Breakfast in America, which came out in 1979. It's a great example because on the sleeve, you have a view from an aeroplane window coming in over the Manhattan skyline. And it's breakfast time, and you've got the Statue of Liberty depicted as a waitress with a glass of orange juice, and the word Supertramp above the Twin Towers, and it all looks fairly straightforward. But when you do a mirror image reversal of it, because I've been saying throughout this chat that we live in an inverted world, we live in a world that's upside down and back to front, and when you want to discover the truth of a matter, you often have to flip things around 180 degrees, and that's where you'll find the truth. And sure enough, when you do a mirror image reversal of the Supertramp sleeve, now, where you had the letters of Supertramp above the Twin Towers, they've turned into a 9 and an 11, and it's directly above the two towers. And bear in mind, this is a view from an aeroplane window at breakfast time.
Yes.
Then there's a very strange occasion in a Prince concert where Prince was giving this show in Utrecht in the Netherlands in December 1998. And right at the end of the show, he says, "I'm going to do one more, then we've got to get back. Got to get back to America. Osama bin Laden's getting ready to bomb." And
Yes.
A lot of people might write that off as some random throwaway comment about Osama bin Laden, but straight after that, he says, 2001, hit me.
Explain that, please.
Exactly. So this is shortly before the events of 2011. Prince appears to have foreknowledge that something is going to go off in that year and it's going to be pinned on Osama bin Laden. And if people don't believe me, you can get the video to that concert on YouTube, and many other researchers have looked into it as well. So there's lots of other examples of apparent foreknowledge of 9/11.
If I can interject a second.
Yeah.
I'd like to say, if people don't believe that these hints were given about the actual 9/11 attacks, you can also you have also movies to watch and TV series like The Lone Gunman, for example, which is the exact same thing that happened on 9/11. So, and it was aired on I think summer 2001. So it was right before the event took place, and it is there's also a German advertisement that was aired September 2001 at the early September, in the early days, where there's this plane that is breaking through, is crashing on a skyscraper in New York City. So if people don't believe, are skeptical about Prince and all these other hints in the music world, they can watch the TV world. So
yeah, and also you get it in cartoons. The Simpsons have previous on this. The Simpsons has predicted many events before they've happened. 9/11, there's a famous still that people can get an image of online of Bart holding up a comic, and it's got New York on it, and it's got the Twin Towers, and you get a 9 and an 11 directly above the Twin Towers on this comic. In Family Guy, there was an apparent prediction of what was going to happen with the Boston Marathon bombing, where you got this guy who's running the marathon, and then the next thing a bomb goes off, and you find this in cartoons the whole time. And the only way this is possible, unless people are going to chalk it all up as coincidence, there will be people that will say, "Oh, it's just one of those things. It's just the way it goes." Really, when the odds of it happening,
I don't think so.
Are probably, a statistical mathematician would put the odds of this just being random chance at billions upon billions to 1. So the only way this can be happening then, if you eliminate that it's just one of those things and it's random, is if ultimately the individuals and the organisations that control The Simpsons, Family Guy, music videos, Hollywood movies are in some way connected and affiliated with the groups or the agencies that brought off the events of 9/11, the Boston Marathon bombing, Sandy Hook, the Aurora theatre shooting, and all these other events, which are predicted in these works of apparent fiction. That's the only explanation you can come to. And of course, that's what it is. When you go far enough up the control structure, the pyramid, to use that analogy, you find that there's a very, very small number of groups and networks at the top that are filtering down and dictating what is going to happen in all these other industries. And they liaise with each other, and they cooperate with each other to pull these things off. It's the same way that certain pop stars become so big overnight. How did Lady Gaga become so massive, just to use her as an example again? Because these industries can make these things happen. They decide which acts get rotation on TV stations and radio stations. They decide which acts are going to be paraded on the US Super Bowl halftime show and the Grammys and all the rest of it. None of it's left to chance. It's all planned, and it's all chosen ones, and it's all these different organisations working together in tandem with each other, in tandem with their occult belief system.
Yes, and I think the sooner we will realize this, the better. Otherwise, the alternative it's not going to be very pleasant for our species.
Well, exactly. I would say the biggest threat facing humanity at the moment is another one that we've seen promoted and pushed and glorified big time in the music industry, and particularly through electronic dance music, like I was saying earlier. And that's this whole transhumanist smart grid reality that we're all being pushed into at a shocking rate, absolutely alarming rate. Society is changing so much, so quickly on this digital kind of smart level. Everything now is electronic. They're rolling out smart meters everywhere, smart motorways, smart cities, Wi-Fi networks everywhere, electromagnetic networks, microwave links. Everything is connected in this way, and it spells a very dangerous future for humanity if it's allowed to go on in this way. We got the whole 5G network, which is just ready to be rolled out. And it's going to be very damaging to human health, because we were never designed by the Creator to live in this kind of existence where you've got this level of electromagnetic pollution everywhere, and all these signals and all these frequencies going off and penetrating us and getting to the very core of us. It's not a natural way of living. It's very anti-creation.
But it's convenient.
and this is the key to it, because these occult controllers that we have, they see themselves as gods in their own sick, twisted, psychopathic, egoic mindsets. They want to create a new version of this world, of creation itself. It goes against everything that is natural and everything that comes from the divine creator, which is why they're obsessed with this virtual reality, artificial intelligence future. They're trying to shape this reality in their own image, in their own methods. And that's why we're all being coerced and steered very quickly towards this transhumanist future. where we're just one step away from our very selves being merged with technology to become bloody robots and something less than human, which is our true nature. This is really the most dangerous thing that is happening right now. And we're very much up against it in terms of the time we've got left to stop this madness in its tracks. And this is why the transhumanist way of doing things, this artificial intelligence future, is being pushed so readily through entertainment, and it's being presented as, isn't this great? Isn't this wonderful? Look what we can achieve. Just think what we can become. Look how much more convenient your life would be when everything is done by this smart grid system. It's a very dangerous, satanic mindset, actually, which goes absolutely against everything that is pure and natural in creation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now I was just, I heard recently about some surgery that was performed, and they used, they implanted a microchip to, I think was to give sight again to somebody that was, that had an eye illness that was turning blind very quickly. I don't know if I'm mistaken.
Well, this is how they sell it to us. They sell it to us that, isn't this great? Look how it saved this person's life. Isn't it wonderful what we can do now?
Yeah, exactly what I thought. And unfortunately, they may, have some application. Like the vaccines. They presented them at the time, and they eradicated some illnesses that were they were going rampant in those times. But that was actually a tactic, and they themselves admitted in one of their books. I think it is a book by the guy that had a part on the creation of the polio vaccine.
Right.
And he admitted that they were introducing these vaccines as sort of, this to eradicate this very brutal, these illnesses that were causing a lot of harm. So in that way, then they'll come again and put all sorts of things inside these vaccines.
Yeah. And well, there's two things that people need to get over. I'm talking about the masses out there, the general public. There's just two misconceptions that people really need to shake off, that they've been conditioned to take on all their lives. One is the idea that, the government would never do that. Yeah. So you can mention something like how this 5G transhumanist smart grid network is going to be really detrimental to human health. All the radiation is going to make lots of people ill. And many people will say, the government wouldn't allow it if it's unsafe. They care about us. It must be okay, or they wouldn't be doing it. And then the second thing you hear is, even if the government were corrupt and were out to hurt us, the mainstream media would tell us about it. And that, of course, assumes that those working in the BBC and Fox News and CNN and all the rest of them are really nice people that just want to help us, and they've got the ability to research stories freely, and they can go out there and uncover truth wherever it takes them, and they don't have any corporate agendas to uphold, and, they've got nothing to lose by doing that. And people really need to get real about this. Governments are not there to help you. They're there to control you. The very word government, when you break it down, actually means mind control.
Yeah.
So that's telling you something. And then, these mainstream journalists, why do you think it is that every evening you turn on the mainstream news, or every day you buy a so-called newspaper, it's the same friggin' stories? So they're not going out there and sniffing out stories for themselves. They're all reporting the same stories that they're told to report in every single outlet. So get away from this idea that the government would never do that, because they do it all the time, and get away from the idea that the mainstream media would tell us, because they don't. It's down to us to take the personal responsibility to look into these things for ourselves. Anyone with eyes to see and a mind to think can do it. You don't need any kind of university education. I never went to university. You don't need letters after your name. You don't need any kind of special qualifications. You just need to have the care and the responsibility to want to know these things. We have this wonderful thing called the internet, which for as long as it's here and before it gets shut down, is available to us to do free independent research off our own backs and look into things instead of relying on others to tell us what to think. You know, we all have the capacity for free critical thought in that way. At least at the moment we still do. So let's not squander that. Let's take that responsibility very seriously.
So another thing is they often say, you know, people when they say they'll never do that, they actually think, you know, I'd never do that.
Exactly.
In
exactly.
that case, I often say, you know, you won't.
Well, you're not a psychopath.
They
That's
will.
why.
They are going to, not
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
It's them. They
You see, a psychopath has no remorse, no capacity for empathy. They could drop a bomb on a village full of sleeping children and go back to bed and sleep soundly that night. You and I would never be able to do that, but a psychopath can. And psychopaths, unfortunately, run our governments and run our businesses.
Yeah, and yes, that's the big thing that people have to realize: the psychology of power. Actually.
Exactly.
And
we should wrap up now, mate, if we can.
So well, you know, thank you very much for being here and talking to us. And so I hope you understood the most of what I was asking you.
Oh, well, I certainly did, yeah. I hope the listenership was able to understand me.
No, well, I'll have to I'll put subtitles anyway, so if I can.
Okay, great. That's a lot of work, but
yeah, that's pretty much.
Respect
so
to you
if I manage it, I'll publish it with subtitles.
Okay, great. All right, well, it's great to talk to you today, and we covered quite a lot of ground.
Yeah.
I hope it made sense to people. I hope people just feel inspired to do something, because I don't do these interviews and these talks and write these books so people can take on the information and say, oh, that's interesting, and then just sit on it and do nothing with it.
Yeah.
Initially, you take it all into yourself and you absorb it and you think, yeah, that's interesting, but there comes a point where you have to do something with it. Because unless people use that information to get active and place obstacles in the path of this control system in whatever way they can, and to remove their cooperation from it, to stop acquiescing and cooperating with what they've got planned for us, until people start doing that in their large numbers, nothing is going to change. So it's very important, once people have taken on this knowledge, this understanding, they do something with it. Whatever it is, there's always contributions that people can make. Everyone's contribution will be different, but they'll all in some way contribute towards heading off this madness and this insanity that we're all hurtling towards very quickly.
Yeah.
So, if I could just mention my new book.
Oh yeah, sure. Please go ahead, and also if you want to tell people where can they find your work.
Sure. Well, both volumes of my book, Musical Truth Volumes 1 and 2, are available on Amazon. So if people want to order them from Amazon, they can get the paperback from there. There's also a hardback version and a Kindle version. And if anyone would like a signed copy from me sent out from my personal stash, they're very welcome to drop me an email, markdevlinuk@gmail.com. And if they can pay by PayPal, I can just mail a copy out from there. I've got a whole load of podcasts under the brand of Good Vibrations, which is conversation-based podcasts. And I've got another one called The Sound of Freedom, which is conscious music, really meaningful, uplifting message music. You can get both of those on my Spreaker page. So if you go to Spreaker.com and search for Mark Devlin there, you can find them. I've got a bunch of videos on my YouTube channel, including some of my conference talks. So that's at youtube.com/MarkDevlinTV. And everything else is on my main website, which is markdevlin.co.uk. And again, if anyone wants to reach out to me to correspond, they can email me on markdevlinuk@gmail.com. And I just want to thank you again, Francesco, for reaching out and for making this interview happen. Because, like I say, it's important. It's important to reach new audiences and try and hit people with this information that might not otherwise have heard it. So, thank you for taking the initiative on that.
Well, it was an honor and a pleasure.
No worries.
Bye.
All the best.
To you too.